Hello, my name is Deborah Donnell, and I am a biostatistician who's been working in HIV prevention trials for the past 20 years. I work at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center with the HIV Prevention Trials Network, and also at the Department of Global Health at the University of Washington. I'm currently one of the lead statisticians in HPTN 083, and I was also the lead statistician for the Partners PrEP trial that led to the licensing of Truvada, or was one of the trials that led for the licensing of Truvada by the FDA. In this presentation, I will discuss a placebo counterfactual approach the HPTN 083 team had planned. We had anticipated this might be necessary if both the products in HPTN 083 were equally successful, so that the number of HIV infections was very low and the trial might not have achieved a clear non-inferiority result. In the actual trial, of course, this did not happen. So to try and introduce this idea, currently the PrEP trials we're doing use an active control arm. So all participants in both 083 and 084 are using an active product, either Truvada as the active control or cabotegravir as an experimental. So as I said, there's a concern that if both products were highly and equally effective, the trial results would be inconclusive. For example, if the HPTN 083 results had actually been 26 events in each arm, our result would have had a relative risk of 1 and the 95% confidence interval that went from 0.38 to 1.72. We would have had a result that had very low evidence, and so kind of evidence of efficacy, but inconclusive evidence of non-inferiority because that confidence interval is very, very wide. So there was interest in understanding the effect of these new PrEP agents versus a true placebo, which of course we can't have in the trial. This is interesting and useful as supplementary evidence that the experimental drug truly is working in the same way that Truvada works, and also would be useful for understanding population impact. So the word counterfactual really is taken from counter to fact, counter to what actually happened. And the idea for the counterfactual is to use data from the placebo arm of another HIV prevention trial. These placebo data would be most convincing if they had overlap in risk populations, overlap in time, and overlap in baseline risk characteristics. And also it's very helpful that they are including follow-up about HIV in a clinical trial setting, expecting to give similar more convincing evidence about the relevance of the placebo arm. So the idea here is we have HPTN 083, which has 2 active arms, and another prevention trial, which includes a placebo arm. And the idea is that we use data from the other trial with the placebo arm to try to create a counterfactual placebo arm for 083. In the case of HPTN 083, we actually have the AMP trial, an antibody-mediated protection is what AMP stands for, that we could have used as a counterfactual for HPTN 083. And here I've compared the characteristics of the 2 trials. HPTN 083 was a randomization to Truvada versus cabotegravir. AMP was doing a 3-way randomization with 2 arms using the monoclonal antibody VRC01 in 2 different doses and a placebo. There is good overlap in the countries that were enrolling in the trial. Both trials had a significant number of sites in the US and in Latin America. Both were enrolling populations of MSM and transgender women, all over the age of 18. And the sample sizes for both trials and the person years accumulated were relatively high. We also had overlap in the time that these trials were operating. HPTN 083 started enrolling in October 2016 and completed follow-up in May of 2020. AMP started enrolling in April of 2016 and completed follow-up in April of 2020. And here I'm showing you the relative number of subjects and person years by these, the groups in the trial, in the HPTN 083 trial. And as you can see, the AMP trial has a considerable overlap in the US Black and non-Black population and in Latin America, but no sites in Asia or Africa. So the proposal for the counterfactual would be to limit to the subgroups of US Black and non-Black populations and Latin American, and use the placebo subjects in AMP to create a counterfactual placebo for those same subsites in HPTN 083. As you can see in the percentages under the person years here, the relative contribution from each of these subgroups is different in the two trials, and the analysis method we use needs to account for that. I also want to mention in this particular situation, we could do a more precise matching because these trials are being run by the NIAID network trials. We actually had 19 sites that were enrolling in both trials simultaneously. So we could also do a more precise match by including only those 19 sites. However, you can see it reduces the amount of information we're using from both trials considerably. So of the 6,389 person years, we would only be including about a third of that. So it's more precise, but includes less information. I wanted to say a word about how the statistical methods work here. So we start by defining these overlapping subgroups that exist between the target trial and the external trial, as I've shown you. So you have the set of S subgroups selected to characterize groups. Essentially, those groups are defined as having different HIV risk, known different HIV risk. You calculate the person years in the CAB arm for each of those subgroups, and the observed incidence in the CAB arm restricted to that subgroup. Then you take the data from the external trial and work out the HIV incidence in the placebo arm of each of those subgroups. And you weight that incidence by the person years to end up matching the person years from HPTN 083, this should say, my apologies. And the idea here is that you are trying to calculate the incidence that would have been seen if there had been a placebo arm in HPTN 083. Once you've calculated that, you can then calculate a counterfactual relative risk by comparing the counterfactual placebo arm to the observed incidence in the target trial within the subgroup S. So that is the ratio of the observed incidence to the counterfactual placebo incidence. Confidence intervals for the counterfactual placebo and relative risk are essentially based on sample survey methodology with the analysis done on a log scale. I'd also note that in HPTN 083 in particular, we can also calculate a counterfactual estimate for Truvada efficacy, and I'll come back to this. So now I want to do it with data so you can see how this might look. So here is the contributions from these three groups seen in the cabotegravir arm for HPTN 083. In the three groups, US Black, US non-Black, and Latin American. So we have fairly even contributions from each of these three groups of 27% person years down to 40% person years. The number of infections that were actually seen in HPTN 083 was 4 in the US Black group, none in the US non-Black group, and 6 in Latin America. Now I'm going to show you how we would compute a counterfactual with the AMP data. So the first thing I want to tell you is these incidence numbers in the AMP trial are not the true incidence numbers. I have completely made them up, so I want to make that clear. But just for the purposes of illustration, I thought it'd be useful to do this. These are the person years, the 17%, 41%, 42%, so they are not as even as in HPTN 083. And if we assume that there was 2%, 1%, and 4% incidence, we would see approximately this number of events in the AMP trial in the placebo arm. Then we compute the weights, okay? And by essentially matching these person years to the observed person years. This is the design weight that we use to match the HPTN 083 person years, and this would be the weighted contribution of imaginary events from AMP. I then go on, I just point out those are only from the placebo. I then compute this counterfactual placebo incidence rate as we would normally do using the weighting. And this gives us a counterfactual placebo incidence rate of 2.52 with a confidence interval as stated here. And this confidence interval takes into account the fact that we've done this reweighting. And this essentially says if HPTN 083 had had a placebo arm, we estimate that the incidence rate would be 2.52 in that placebo arm based on data and evidence from the placebo arm of AMP. Using this, we can compute a counterfactual relative efficacy. The incidence in CAB arm was 0.39. The imaginary counterfactual incidence from AMP is 2.52. And then we can calculate this counterfactual relative risk of 0.16 together with a 95% confidence interval, and would state that the counterfactual efficacy estimate would be an 84% reduction in risk compared to placebo. So just a couple of other comments. In the actual AMP trial, Truvada was available for all participants throughout follow-up. So the counterfactual incidence estimate would be in the presence of Truvada as a standard of care. So for example, if in AMP, there's truly a 50% effective use of Truvada, that would reduce incidence perhaps by about 50% compared to no Truvada use. On the other hand, if hardly anyone was using Truvada, then we have no reduction in HIV incidence. We do in AMP have a dry blood spot measure about Truvada use that's available for about 10% of the participant visits. So our plan would be to develop an approach to model the counterfactual incidence in the absence of Truvada. And I think in future prevention trials where people are thinking about using this counterfactual approach, use of effective HIV prevention will modify the observed rates of HIV in the community. And we do have to develop statistical methods for adjusting for Truvada use. A further refinement is that in our trial, in the HPTN 083 trial, we can actually look at get a sense of the internal validity of our counterfactual using the Truvada arm, because we can construct a placebo counterfactual for the Truvada arm and compare that to the modeled efficacy for known, i.e. we are measuring adherence to Truvada in HPTN 083. And we can put those two things together and see whether it supports the accuracy of the counterfactual estimate. As I mentioned, estimates could be more closely matched by site or by overlapping time or by additional risk covariates, but it does usually mean we have less data. So there's this trade-off between precision and variability. So in summary, the FDA briefing document for the Antimicrobial Drugs Advisory Committee did indicate an openness to the use of counterfactuals where randomized comparisons are not feasible. So this approach, I think, is one we're going to see more of. Counterfactual estimates, of course, don't have the strength of evidence of a randomized comparison, but they are objective and they could be strengthened with predefined criteria for success. I think most of us think that this counterfactual evidence will also need to be supported with other evidence, such as adherence and HIV incidence in an active control arm. The validity of this counterfactual approach may decline as contemporaneous placebo arm data become less available and use of HIV prevention drugs in the community increases. Nonetheless, we have pretty strong evidence that ARV-based systemic drugs with longer acting formulations have a very high efficacy, and the reduction in HIV infection risks are large. We believe probably greater than 80%. So comparisons against a placebo are likely to end up being pretty convincing. So I'd like to end by thanking my collaborators in this counterfactual work and thanking the AMP investigators for access to their person years and acknowledge the support that I have within the HIV Prevention Trials Network.